Besant. I'm the director of the John Dewey Research Centre for the Didactics of Democracy. And I've brought a new piece for you today. Normally I'd say something like, I have a great new piece for you. But this time, I honestly don't know how to present it. Yes, it's new, but it's also heavy, disturbing, urgent, because this time we felt we couldn't avoid the topic of war any longer. So, welcome. Welcome to civic education in times of war. And maybe right up front, consider this your trigger warning. What you're about to hear contains unsettling insights into the strategies used by Russian and Ukrainian teachers. And it forces us to ask, what can we, in Germany, learn from this for our own civic education? Oh, and one more thing, just to frame the tone. This piece was written the day after the historic meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office. A meeting that ended with a brutal realization for Europe. We can no longer rely on the United States as a protective power. I think it's time we seriously start thinking about what we do, what we really do, when the situation escalates even further. And when I say we, I mean all of us who are involved in civic education, institutions, initiatives, individuals. Because here in Germany, we've been thinking about civic education under the comfortable illusion of peace. Under conditions of stability, democracy, and security. We think about how to get people to care about politics, maybe even how to get them to vote, even if there's a big soccer match on the same day. That might sound cynical, but it shows how far removed we are from the question, what happens to civic education when things get uncomfortable? When peace is no longer guaranteed? What if war is no longer just something from the past, or something that happens elsewhere? What if it starts to seep into our present? There is no good answer to that. Let me ask you, if we project ourselves 10 years into the future, when would we say the war began? Lieutenant General André Bodeman said this back in spring 2024.
We are not at war, but we have not been at peace for a long time.
Now, in spring 2025, the picture has sharpened. Trump has returned to power. He's made it crystal clear that the post-war order, the one Germany and Europe have relied on for decades, means nothing to him. The NATO we knew is gone. Russia and China are emboldened. Europe, our Europe, is now seriously considering nuclear weapons. We are not prepared. And many still refuse to acknowledge the storm that's already here. At the John Dewey Centre, we see ourselves as a think tank for democratic education. Our mission is to support those working in youth and adult education with the tools they need, especially when the context shifts. Right now, that means we must ask ourselves what to do if things continue to deteriorate. If these thoughts prove unnecessary in the end, good. We're not here to be right. We're here to be ready. Let's start by taking stock. What do we actually know about civic education under conditions of war? Well, in Germany, we remember how education was misused by the Nazis. We remember political indoctrination, propaganda, the suppression of dissent. We remember how civic education as it existed during the Weimar Republic was wiped out almost overnight. We know that the Nazis didn't want young people to learn how to question authority. They didn't want them to learn democracy or discuss political ideas intellectually. They wanted obedience, recruitment, submission. Looking at this historical chapter offers important historical contrast, but very little in terms of guidance for today. So, if the past can't teach us much, what can? Maybe we need to look at places where war is happening right now. Russia and Ukraine. Let's start with Russia, the aggressor. How do teachers in Russia talk about this war? What can we learn from them, or in spite of them? Evgenia Efimova conducted a powerful study in 2022. She interviewed 26 Russian teachers shortly after the invasion of Ukraine. They weren't political educators, at least not officially. But the war forced them to confront their role, their responsibility, their voice. Here's what she found: 5 distinct strategies. 5 ways teachers navigate the unbearable. Strategy 1. Creating an island of stability. War as an emotional, not political, burden. These teachers saw their students in pain, crying in class, hiding behind sarcasm. Their response? Offer comfort, create a sense of normalcy. Talk about war only in abstract moral terms. War is bad, peace is good. They avoided politics entirely. They spoke of war like it was a natural disaster, something we can't change, only survive. Focus on family. Focus on school. Don't waste your time on politics. Strategy 2. Facilitating dialogue. War as a moment of civic judgment. These teachers, often from history or social science, chose to talk. They helped students ask questions, sort through facts, develop opinions. They stayed neutral, careful, but they did not shut down the conversation. This is the closest we get to what we'd call democratic education. But in Russia, even neutrality can be dangerous. Strategy 3. Using the war to build connection. War brings us closer. Some teachers saw this as a rare moment to bond with students, to build trust. Even if their views differed, even if fear lingered, they opened the door to honest talk. For some, this was a bold move. For others, a way to test loyalty. And for a few, a quiet act of resistance. Strategy 4. Mission and recruitment. War as a call to arms of mind and spirit. Here, the goal was persuasion. One teacher proudly screened government propaganda during his computer science class, a film about special operations. He knew some students wouldn't accept it, but he pushed anyway. And then there were teachers on the other side, critical of the government, who tried to provoke students out of their silence. "I don't know how else to say it," one teacher admitted, "so I joke. I joke about the horror, because I want them to remember this isn't normal." Both believed the classroom is political. Both refused to stay neutral. Both tried to shake their students awake. So what do we take from this? These are not perfect models. These are responses to impossible situations. But they force us to ask, what would we do if this happened here? Would we still treat political education as a quiet, polite subject about voting and values? Or would we finally understand what it means to teach democracy when democracy is under fire? It's getting late. Not just in the day, but in the arc of history. We need to stop pretending peace is permanent. We need to prepare for discomfort, for complexity, for resistance. Because if the classroom is not a place for courage, then where will courage be born? Strategy 5. Avoidance. Keeping politics out of the classroom. Many teachers in Russia try, even in such extreme circumstances, to keep politics out of school. They regard political discussions among students as provocation, distraction, or socially risky, and therefore this should be avoided at all costs. Teachers who follow this strategy usually cite the need for neutrality as the reason they don't disclose their personal political views. They believe political discussions should take place at home, not at school, and that interference by teachers could lead to conflict with parents, something even less acceptable in times like these. They also tend to view politics as the domain of specialists, and not as something that falls within their educational mandate. In practice, this strategy takes various forms. Some teachers shut down conversations immediately when students ask their opinion, or give neutral common sense responses. Others say they stuck strictly to the curriculum, turned to historical references, and made their neutrality visible by deliberately avoiding any kind of moral or normative judgment regarding the current war. That concludes Efimova's findings and our look at Russian teachers. So why did we explore this in such detail? First, because there are very few studies that collected data so soon after the outbreak of war, and with such clarity of mind. That alone is deeply impressive. But also because the patterns we see in these Russian classrooms may feel less foreign than we'd like to think. Let me stress again, these teachers are working under extremely difficult circumstances. Russia is not a democracy. It is drifting further and further into totalitarianism. How is one supposed to talk about war in a classroom when even the word war is banned? And yet, we recognize these strategies. We know the arguments for school neutrality. We're familiar with avoidance behavior. We know teachers who take on the role of moderators only, and we've heard the relationship-oriented debates around safe spaces. None of this is unfamiliar to us in Germany, even though we are working in far less challenging educational environments. When it comes to difficult topics like dealing with right-wing extremism, Behrens, 2014, already identified similar patterns of behavior among German teachers. So we must assume that the strategies teachers use, especially the intuitive ones, don't actually differ that much under pressure. Now let's take a look at the other side. The defenders. Educational responses to war in Ukraine. The strategies used by Ukrainian educators in response to war. At first glance, some of them may look similar to the ones we've seen in our Russian case study, but the specific ways they are implemented and how they are framed differ significantly. And that's largely because Ukraine is not the aggressor here. It is the country under attack. It's important to note, when it comes to Ukraine, we don't yet have a similarly in-depth, reconstructive study like Efimova's. So we have to piece together the educational response from different sources. Still, it's remarkable that educational research is actively continuing in Ukraine, even in wartime, and that it continues to engage with international academic discourse. Interestingly, only a small portion of recently published Ukrainian studies explicitly address the war. To structure our findings, we again use the framework developed by Efimova. So let's start with Strategy 1, creating an island of stability. Stability as the basis for survival. Ukrainian teachers, too, are trying to create a sense of stability for their students through education. But to understand what that means, we need to consider the scale of destruction. Since February 2022, an average of 22 schools per day have been attacked. As of the time of writing, according to the Ukrainian government, 365 educational institutions have been completely destroyed, and 3,798 have been severely damaged. Additionally, many undamaged schools are being used as emergency shelters. Some teachers have been drafted into the military. Others have fled or been killed. In this context, creating an island of stability, first and foremost, means ensuring that children can receive any kind of education at all. That has led to some striking responses. Classrooms were set up in subway stations and bomb shelters. The Ukrainian school system pivoted quickly to online and hybrid formats. Or, like Zaplatinsky said,
In order to increase the level of safety of the participants in the educational process, the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine suggested using the advantages of distance and mixed forms of education.
This task was made easier by the fact that digital tools and methods had already been introduced during the pandemic. Textbooks were made available online so they could be accessed in safe spaces, or during displacement or exile. Teachers conducted classes from shelters, connecting with students in multiple countries. Despite the massive disruption, Ukrainian educators even managed to continue offering native language instruction to refugee children across Western Europe. Strategy 2. Moderating conversations about war. War is a challenge for critical thinking and civic judgment. While the first set of strategies focused on logistics and survival, here we begin to see how the war has also impacted educational content in Ukraine. Since 2022, Ukrainian curricula have been revised to give greater prominence to topics like international law, human rights, the EU, and of course the Russian invasion itself. These subjects have been integrated into the fields of civics and legal education, again with the word of Zaplatinsky.
The Russian war caused an increase in the importance of subjects of civic and historical education in order to form a clear conceptual system that will prevent the influence of enemy propaganda.
That's a compelling argument for strengthening civic education in times of war. And it's worth noting that civic education, more precisely Gromadianska osvita, has long been part of the Ukrainian school system. But over the past 10 years, and especially since 2022, it has evolved from a dry, institutional subject into something much more dynamic and real. It now addresses current events, promotes democratic values, and encourages active participation in society. The Ministry of Education is fully aware that online and hybrid formats mean parents often witness or participate in these lessons too. The goal is to prepare not just students, but all citizens to recognize disinformation and resist propaganda. Instead of countering Russian propaganda with their own version, Ukraine is investing in the democratic capacity of its people. New school subjects have also been introduced, like Basics of Health and Health, Safety and Well-being. These courses cover everything from first aid to coping with trauma, and even how to recognize landmines. Which brings us to the next strategy. Strategy 3. Using the moment to build connection. War brings us closer together. One of the most visible shifts in Ukrainian education hasn't been in civic education, but in language instruction, especially Russian. Even before 2022, interest in Russian as a school subject was declining. After the invasion, official programs promoting Russian language and literature were removed from the curriculum altogether. Teachers are now required to demonstrate proficiency in Ukrainian to continue teaching. On the surface, this might seem like a nationalist move, but it's more accurate to call it a shift in perspective. The foreign languages now prioritized are those spoken in the EU, especially English and French. The goal is integration, not isolation. Strategy 4. Mission and recruitment. Preparing for self-defense. Ukraine has been at war since 2014. General mobilization was declared in February 2022 and tightened again in spring 2024. The country is short on soldiers. From the outside, it's hard to assess how much the Ukrainian state is using education to recruit future fighters. But there are well-documented defense camps outside the school system that are open to boys and girls from age 12. These camps are extremely popular. Many young people participate to reclaim a sense of control in the face of overwhelming loss. Some have lost family members or friends. Journalists have been given access to these camps, and the messaging is clear.
We do not teach our children how to kill. That's not what we want. But we do want a generation that grows up ready to protect themselves.
Strategy 5. Avoidance? Not really. Unlike in Russia, we haven't found evidence of an avoidance strategy in Ukrainian schools. While some international organizations like Save the Children offer play-based programs focused on giving children moments of peace and normalcy, these always include elements of trauma support. In Ukraine, war is not a topic that can be avoided. It is part of daily life. Conclusion. What can we learn from all this? After examining the educational responses to active war in both Russia and Ukraine, we come to a difficult but necessary question. What can we learn from these observations? Interestingly, the strategies employed by Russian teachers often seem more familiar to us in Germany. Avoidance, especially under the banner of political neutrality, is something we know well. In contrast, the Ukrainian educational interventions may feel far more foreign. Military training for 12-year-olds? That's deeply unsettling. But what does that say about us? Are German educators, in some respects, more similar to their Russian counterparts than to the Ukrainian ones? That's a disturbing question, one that we instinctively want to reject. And we should reject it because the political contexts in which these strategies arise are fundamentally different. And maybe that's the real learning potential of this whole comparison. So what do we learn from all of this? We've come up with 7 points. 1. Avoidance strategies are a luxury. And by luxury, we mean this. The basic structures of education are not directly affected by the conflict. In that sense, the German and Russian perspectives show some similarities. Maybe that's why Russian strategies of avoidance feel more familiar to us than the Ukrainian ones. Because when teachers try to avoid the conflict, it's based on the fantasy that what we don't talk about simply doesn't exist in the classroom. But let's call it what it is: a fantasy. Even in German or Russian classrooms, there are children from Ukraine, or with cousins and relatives there. And even if that's not the case, the fact of this war has made its way into the minds of students and reshapes what school feels like. 2. Avoidance doesn't work. It doesn't help. It leads to indifference and leaves children alone with their fears. And no, neutrality doesn't equal democracy or pluralism, even if we sometimes believe that in Germany. Look at Russia. We see these strategies there too, in a clearly non-democratic context. What's really behind avoidance is uncertainty. Teachers who don't want to cross lines or clash with regulations. But it shows a lack of clarity about the purpose of education. 3. Practicing resilience. From what we can see, Ukraine isn't going the route of cheap nationalist indoctrination. That's remarkable for a country at war. Instead, they focus on building resilient structures, including ongoing education. Ukraine presents itself here as a functioning state, fulfilling its duties. In this case, to its youngest citizens. And that makes a difference. We learned that during the pandemic too, parents need to be able to focus on something beyond just surviving with their kids. 4. Teaching children in exile. In the early months of the war, when many Ukrainian children had already fled the country, often with their mothers, it was Ukrainian teachers who stepped in to provide education abroad. Either because they had also fled and quickly took up teaching again, or because they continued to teach online from inside Ukraine. There was even a meme going around, Ukrainians joking that Germans struggled with online learning. How can you not manage this when we're literally doing it under bombs? What helped the Ukrainians was the experience from the pandemic. Digital structures were already in place. That's something to take seriously. In a crisis, it's nearly impossible to invent new systems on the fly. They have to be practiced beforehand by both teachers and families. 5. Countering propaganda. Keeping communication with the population going and resisting hostile propaganda is another key strategy in war. President Zelensky's daily video messages were one smart move, but schools played a role too. The Ukrainian government recognized that media literacy and civic education are essential tools for resisting disinformation. Honestly, it would have been better to start that before the war. But even in peacetime, we should talk about this. Yes, we want to protect younger kids from harsh realities. But still, we need to create awareness of what war is today. It's not just tanks and guns anymore, and there's plenty of literature on this. See Münkler, 2002. But we don't have to read every page in class. Sometimes, just looking at a single image might be enough. 6. Strengthening democracy instead of waving flags. Even kids ask, "What's this war for?" And yes, one answer is, it's for the survival of a free and independent Ukraine. But beyond that, it's about self-determination. And the Ukrainian curriculum revisions after 2022 show they're not falling into cheap patriotism. Instead, they're strengthening subjects like human rights and international law. You might ask, what's the use of knowing your rights if no one respects them? But we could ask the same about children's rights in Germany. They're also often ignored. The point of political education is not to teach rules because they're followed, but because people need to know them in order to fight for them. That's what makes the Ukrainian approach smart and worth learning from. 7. Defense strategies, a painful topic. It's probably the hardest part, thinking about the fact that there are military training camps for 12-year-olds in Ukraine. That's awful. We don't want that. Of course not. But what do we do with that knowledge? Because the truth is, in Germany, we're already preparing young people again for the possibility that compulsory service might return. Sure, we'll call it peace service, as the Bavarian Green Youth suggested, but it still touches the same nerve. One thing is clear. Under Ukrainian conditions, it makes sense to teach kids, in subjects like health and safety, how to respond to danger, to not pick up grenades, how to care for the wounded. That's not pleasant, but it's real. So yes, that's where we're at. These thoughts aren't final. They can't be. We're not done thinking this through. And this was a long one, a difficult one. So we'll leave it here, for now. If you've got thoughts, ideas, questions, reach out to us. We'd love to hear what else you think we could be learning from all this. Thanks for staying with us and for thinking along. We'll keep watching and thinking. Version of a lecture presented by Anya Besand. It is translated and spoken by AI.